Title: Shattered Innocence. The house was always quiet when his father wasn't home. Too quiet. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but rather suffocating. Oliver had lived in that house for years, each day feeling like he was walking on a tightrope, never knowing when it would snap beneath him. He had never wanted a new mother, and certainly not the woman his father had chosen. Veronica was beautiful, poised, and charming to everyone except him. At first, it had been small things. A cold shoulder here, a dismissive glance there. An offhand insult disguised as a joke, the kind that made others laugh but left him burning with humiliation. A lingering stare that made his skin crawl, as though she was waiting for something. The way she took control of the house, of his father, of every single aspect of their lives. But as the years passed, Veronica's cruelty grew sharper, more insidious. She played her role perfectly in front of his father, smiling and laughing as if she were the perfect wife. But when they were alone, the mask slipped, revealing the twisted amusement in her eyes whenever she saw him struggle. Oliver had no one to turn to. His father, oblivious to the torment, was blinded by love for a woman who had slowly chipped away at his son's soul. Friends? He had long since learned that trying to confide in anyone would only make things worse. No one would believe him. No one would care. And so he endured. Every taunt. Every humiliation. Every moment of her sick, twisted game. He clenched his jaw and waited for the day he could leave that house behind forever. Until he couldn't anymore. The night of his 18th birthday was when everything changed. His father had left on a business trip, leaving him alone with Veronica. He should have expected what was coming, but he had hoped, foolishly, that she would simply ignore him. He spent most of the evening locked in his room, listening to music, willing the hours to pass. Then came the knock. Soft, almost gentle. But he knew better. He ignored it. Then the door creaked open anyway. Veronica stood in the doorway, a glass of wine in her hand, wearing something that was far too revealing. She smiled in a way that sent cold dread creeping down his spine. "You're an adult now, Oliver. We should celebrate." He wanted to run. He wanted to scream. But the moment he hesitated, she stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind her. When it was over, he wasn't the same. Something inside him had snapped, a part of him that had always held onto the belief that things would one day get better. He lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, his mind cold and calculating. This wasn't just cruelty anymore. This was war. He packed a small bag, took the money he had been saving for years, and vanished into the night. But leaving wasn't enough. He wanted her to suffer. At first, he only wanted to make her afraid, to take back control. He broke into the house when she was asleep, moving things just slightly enough to unsettle her. A missing earring. A shattered mirror. The faintest whispers in the hall. She started losing sleep, paranoia creeping into her mind. She stopped being the composed, elegant woman his father adored and instead became a shell of herself, always on edge, always watching over her shoulder. And Oliver watched, savoring every moment. But he wasn't careful enough. One night, as she bathed, he snuck in, holding a hairdryer in his trembling hands. He never intended to kill her, only to scare her, to make her understand the fear he had lived with, to hear her scream the way he had wanted to scream all those years. But as she turned, her eyes widening in horror, his grip slipped, and the device fell into the water. Sparks flew. Her body convulsed. The scream cut off instantly. The silence was deafening. He stood there frozen, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his reflection distorted in the water that now held her lifeless body. Panic surged through him. He had to leave. He had to run. But before he could, his father returned. The horror in his father's eyes was worse than anything Oliver had imagined. "What have you done?" his father whispered, voice shaking with fury and disbelief. "It was an accident," Oliver gasped. "I didn't mean—" But his father wasn't listening. He lunged, his hands reaching for Oliver's throat. Instinct took over. Oliver grabbed the knife from the counter. A single wild swing meant to push him back. And then there was blood. Too much blood. His father crumpled to the floor, choking, staring at his own son in shock as the life drained from his eyes. Oliver ran. For years, he lived in the shadows, constantly on the move. He changed his name, his appearance, taking whatever jobs he could to survive. But no matter how far he ran, the past never left him. He spent nights awake, haunted by memories, by her laughter, by the last breath his father had taken. He avoided relationships, avoided attachments. His world was nothing but shadows and regret. Then, one desperate night, when money had run out and hunger clawed at his ribs, he walked into a small clinic to sell his blood. He barely noticed when they asked for identification, barely registered the form he signed. He just needed enough money to eat. Days later, the police came. He hadn't realized the clinic ran DNA checks, hadn't thought about the database, hadn't known his father had reported him missing before he died. The officers were waiting for him at a rundown motel. The moment they knocked on the door, he knew. There was no point in running anymore. There was no trial. No leniency. The crimes spoke for themselves. The evidence was overwhelming. The judge barely glanced at him before sentencing him to life in prison. No parole. No second chances. As the cell door closed behind him, Oliver exhaled for the first time in years. No more running. No more hiding. He had destroyed her. But in the end, she had destroyed him too. The prison walls were cold, unfeeling. The gray concrete surrounded Oliver like a tomb, the iron bars sealing him in, reminding him that there was no escape. He had spent years running, avoiding the ghosts of his past, but now they had caught up to him. There was no more movement, no more shadows to hide in, only silence and the weight of his thoughts. At first, he tried to push it all away. He spent his days staring at the cracks in the ceiling, memorizing the patterns, pretending that if he focused hard enough, he could forget where he was. The other inmates barely spoke to him. He wasn't one of them. He wasn't a gang member. He wasn't a dealer. He wasn't a career criminal. He was just another broken soul swallowed by this system. At night, the memories came flooding back. Veronica's cruel laughter, the way she had controlled his life, twisted his father's love into something unrecognizable. The night she died. The look in his father's eyes as the blood poured from his chest. The way his hands had trembled when he ran into the night, knowing there was no turning back. The guards treated him like any other inmate, nothing more than a number. The only difference was that Oliver didn't fight back. He didn't argue when they barked orders. He didn't push back when other prisoners tested him. He simply existed, fading into the background, waiting for time to erase him. Weeks passed, then months. The weight of his choices bore down on him like an anchor. He began to see his reflection in the cracked metal mirror above the sink in his cell. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale. He barely recognized himself anymore. He tried to imagine a future, something beyond the endless routine of waking up, eating tasteless food, shuffling through the yard, and returning to his cell. But there was nothing. No one waiting for him. No letters. No visitors. The only person who had ever truly mattered was long dead by his own hand. One night, as the prison lights dimmed and the world fell into silence, Oliver made a decision. He pulled the bedsheet from his cot, tearing it into strips. He worked quietly, methodically, his hands steady in a way they hadn't been in years. He tied the fabric to the bars of his cell, testing its strength. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. As he looped the fabric around his neck, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. This was the only escape left. The only way to finally silence the voices, to put an end to the endless cycle of regret and pain. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and stepped off the edge of his cot. For the first time in years, Oliver felt weightless. The guards found him the next morning, his body swaying gently, the last trace of his existence reduced to an eerie stillness. No one wept. No one mourned. He had long since become a ghost, a forgotten soul lost in the system. In the end, the prison had only been a formality. He had been sentenced to life long before he ever set foot inside.